Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor to moderate today's discussion on women, peace and security. The discussion is co-organized by Latvian Transatlantic Organization, Canadian Embassy and also Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Indeed, the topic is very important and it also has its historical landmarks. For instance, it was exactly 20 years ago when the United Nations Security Council adopted its resolution on women, peace and security, which served as the background for countries and also organizations to proceed with similar policy and with similar approach. If we look at what happened during those 20 years, indeed, we could find very many examples and cases when this resolution was assisting to manage conflict, to pay attention to women, girls, and also children which suffer usually in wars and conflicts most of all. But on the other hand, we cannot be satisfied, and also those who are involved in security policy making, they are also concerned about slow pace of implementation of this resolution. Therefore, in 2018, NATO decided to review women's security and policy approach and to integrate it more into NATO's and also member states' security policy concepts and plans. Therefore, I'm very honored today to moderate this very important discussion, but at the same time to introduce several speakers who come from the countries which always put human security and women and children's security above several other security priorities. And this country is Canada, who was always very much engaged in implementation of UN and also NATO's resolutions. Therefore, it's a great honor to introduce Canadian Ambassador to Latvia, Rex Kevin, please.
Thank you, merci, paldies. And thank you to everyone watching for joining us on this Remembrance Day, wherever in the world you might be. In my mind, I'm hoping that there are thousands of people online watching, and not just my mom, but just to be safe. Hi, Mom. I'm so pleased to be here and to have the chance to open this event on women, peace, and security, the very first side event as part of the superb Riga Conference 2020. Let me start by thanking our friends at the Latvian Transatlantic Organization, the Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Riga Graduate School of Law, for organizing this event, of course, along with my amazing colleagues at the Embassy of Canada. And what a personal thrill it is for me to be invited to join such wonderful guests, Canada's own Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security, Jacqueline O'Neill, NATO Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security, Claire Hutchinson, and my colleagues from the Latvian and on TV, Estonian Foreign Ministries, Kasparas Ozolunch and Avro Anton, and of course, our brilliant moderator, Janeta Ozolinia. So you might be asking yourselves then, why am I here? And well, that's a very reasonable question. As framework nation for NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group, Latvia is now home to the largest contribution of Canadian Armed Forces personnel anywhere in the world outside of the United States of America. We are now some 630 Canadian personnel operating in 12 different locations across all three Baltic countries. The center of our effort is, of course, here in Riga, or just outside of Riga at Camp Adige, where 540 Canadian women and men in uniform serve alongside our Latvian hosts and 9 other NATO allied nations as part of NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group Latvia. And for those who are Canada watchers, you are, of course, aware that our government implemented a feminist foreign policy at the heart of which is the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Canada knows that sustainable peace is only possible when women are fully involved in the resolution of conflict and peace and security efforts. More inclusive, gender equal, and peaceful societies are possible when women participate in conflict prevention, conflict resolution, and post-conflict state building. Canada's defense policy, entitled Strong, Secure, Engaged, with its focus on gender equality and diversity as part of Canada's feminist policy. The policy outlines efforts to increase the diversity of the Canadian Armed Forces and to recruit and retain more women and to promote more women into leadership positions. A target has been set to increase the proportion of women in the Canadian military, presently at 16%, to 25% by 2026. This will in turn increase the number of women available for deployment to multilateral peace operations. Our Chief of Defence Staff, in his directive on Security Council Resolution 1325, committed to the full integration of Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security and of UN 1325 into planning operations all across the Canadian Armed Forces. And in order to accelerate the implementation of the WPS agenda in National Armed Forces, Canada launched the WPS Chief of Defence Staff Network along with the United Kingdom and Bangladesh in 2017. As Canada now chairs the network, we are increasing its membership to drive transformative cultural and institutional change within National Armed Forces all across the globe. So why am I here? I'm here in support of Canada's foreign policy, in support of our defense policy, and I can say what an absolute career milestone it has been for me to be able to cooperate with the Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs as they have developed and implemented their own National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, and my congratulations to your government. I recognize, however, that even in my own country, and thank you for the kind words, not everyone is convinced that a focus on women, peace, and security is necessary. Now, I would disagree. But I would also note that this is something that I have come to learn over my career. See, taking a feminist approach to peace and security is not politically correct talk or virtue signaling. It is a smart, practical solution to hard security needs. We must deal with the serious problems of sexual violence and conflict, as well as abuse and rape by peacekeepers and other international personnel. We must ensure that the particular needs of women and girls are met during conflict and humanitarian crises. Addressing these problems has direct benefits for women, including those who are courageous enough survivors of abuse, but it also clearly contributes to the stability and security of communities as a whole. Gender equality, however, cannot be achieved without engaging men and boys. Everyone must stand up against unequal power relations and systemic discrimination. Women, men, boys, girls, in all of their diversity, benefit from gender-responsive outcomes. And perhaps like some of you watching at home, I was not always aware of this. I mean, look at me, I am the poster child for privilege, an upper middle-class white male coming from Canada. Let's be honest, gender equality was not high on my radar when I joined the Canadian government. When I was first exposed to it in training as a young officer at our International Development Agency, I didn't even really properly understand it. Sex and gender, entrenched power dynamics, I had not noticed it because it had never really personally impacted me, or so I thought. But I had the chance to learn from some of the best gender advisors in the world. And fast forward 10 years, and I was deployed alongside the Canadian military to Kandahar, Afghanistan, where I served as a development advisor. In the country's New Year's celebration, which was hosted by the governor of the province, I was quickly struck by the inescapable fact that amongst the thousands of guests who were in attendance, there was not a single Afghan woman. How was I then meant to provide holistic development advice to my commander when I culturally wasn't even able to speak to 50% of the population? Fortunately for me, I could rely on my friend and colleague, a smart, strong, and tough infantry captain. And as a woman, she and her colleagues could engage with an entire segment of the population that I and the largely male Canadian forces simply could not. Now, Canada, as noted, has always been a strong supporter of women, peace, and security. From its inception, we co-sponsored UN SCR 1325 as a non-permanent member of the Security Council in 2000. And since then, Canada has advocated for the advancement of the WPS agenda in numerous multinational organizations, including the G7, the Francophonie, the Commonwealth, the OSCE, NATO, and the Global Coalition Against Daesh, as well as in our bilateral relations. We have a long history of advocating for and supporting gender equality, of promoting the empowerment of women and girls, of calling for the protection of their human rights, and of fighting sexual and gender-based violence, including in conflict settings. Canada was instrumental in the adoption of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action in 1995, and in bringing the issue of sexual violence against women to the UN's attention. We were a leader in drafting the Rome Statute, which clearly defines rape as a war crime, and in the establishment of the International Criminal Court. We lead the annual resolution on eliminating violence against women at the Human Rights Council and the biennial resolution on ending child, early, and forced marriage in the United Nations General Assembly Third Committee. And in 2000, Canada formed the Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security, an informal group of over 50 UN member states. The group, currently chaired by Canada, shares information and best practices and conducts periodic joint advocacy in the UN context. We recognize that gender equality is a foundation for peace, and we implement the Women, Peace and Security agenda through our National Action Plan, which Ambassador O'Neill will discuss. But we still have a lot to learn. When we cooperate with other states like we did here in Latvia, we not only share our insights, but we gain valuable experience and knowledge from our allies. Barriers to women's full inclusion on issues of peace and security exist in Canada too. Indigenous women and girls, in particular, face intersecting discrimination and violence based on gender, race, socioeconomic status, and other identity factors due to underlying historic causes. I particularly refer to the legacy of Canadian colonialism and the devastation caused by the Canadian residential school systems. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women in Canada continue to pay the heavy price for living at the nexus of colonialism, racism, and sexism. We are striving to come to terms with the historical impacts of these patriarchal and sexist policies, which resulted in the loss of status and community for many women. The Government of Canada has committed to a renewed relationship with Indigenous people in Canada, and we seek to achieve true reconciliation. In conclusion then, let me just quickly highlight some of our areas of cooperation between Canada and Latvia in support of the WPS agenda. Our embassy was very proud to host Canadian General Lise Bourgeon, the Canadian Armed Forces champion for women, peace, and security. The General was able to present some of the Canadian Armed Forces best practices to representatives of the Latvian government and civil society. In February, Canada's Foreign Minister, Minister Champagne, was here for a bilateral visit, and we were able to do a Women, Peace and Security roundtable with Latvian leadership. There's been a request from the Latvian Chief of Defense to Canada's Chief of Defense to provide gender awareness training, and we're looking at doing that by the end of the year. And I was so honored to be able to participate in the launch event of Latvia's National Action Plan in early October. And so, to those of you who might still be asking why I'm here and why does including women and girls matter, I want to say this. It matters because where women are included in peace processes, peace is more enduring. It matters because when women are included in the economy, economic growth is greater. It matters because when women are included in governance, states are more stable. It matters because where women in all of their diversity are included in our collective security, everyone is safer. And it matters because no society can possibly reach its full potential when half of its population is held back. Madam Chair, thank you. Merci. Paldies.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think that majority of those who are following the conference are not surprised why you are here, because Canada is part of human security network, and its foreign policy rests to a very large extent on international engagement, and your international engagement is very much of comprehensive character, looking exactly as you said, not at the half of the population, but trying to look at society at large. And this lesson is, I think, very relevant to very many countries, and I'm happy that Latvia, 20 years after UN resolution was adopted, also has its national action plan. But without any further ado, I would like to give floor to participants of our discussion, and I will introduce speakers in a row of their presentations. And the first speaker today is Arvo Anton, who has a very, very interesting post at the present moment. He is Deputy Coordinator for UN Security Council Affairs. And as we know, Estonia now is one of Security Council members. And since Latvia, to a very large extent, now is preparing for its shot for this council, we are very keen to find out how Estonia is coping with its role and to what extent women, peace and security issues are on your agenda. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon from Tallinn. It's an honor to be part of today's important discussion and the distinguished panel. I would like to indeed make few comments on women, peace and security agenda from the Estonian perspective. The year 2020 should be a year of celebrations as the United Nations turns 75 years old. 2020 is also a milestone as 25 years passes from signing the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action, and 20 years from indeed adoption of the United Nations Security Council landmark resolution 1325. Celebrations on all of these anniversaries have taken place, but the COVID-19 pandemic has made its corrections to our initial plans, as it has severely affected the progress on realizing global commitments on gender equality and on women, peace and security agenda. In its last annual report on women, peace and security, the UN Secretary General highlights the impact the resolution 1325 has had in the last 20 years. For example, in the first 5 years since the resolution was adopted, only 15% of the Security Council resolutions included explicit references to women, peace and security issues. Between 2017 and 19, however, this number was approximately 70%. Since 2000, Security Council has adopted 9 follow-up resolutions to the 1325, centered on the importance of women's human rights and leadership in preventing and responding to crises. All of us have taken concrete commitments on women, peace and security, be it nationally, regionally, in the United Nations or as a Security Council. As of August this year, 86 countries worldwide have adopted national action plans on women, peace and security. In 2010, there were only 19. EU and NATO have their regional action plans. Women, peace and security is high in the agenda of the work of OSCE and also African Union. And indeed, in this regard, I would like to use the opportunity now to congratulate also Latvia for the adoption of your first national action plan this year. Well done. All in all, it illustrates that there is a solid and rising understanding and recognition around the globe on the importance of women, peace and security agenda. However, the Secretary General in his report also points out that the progress has been too slow, too narrow, with setbacks and easy to reverse. The setbacks are ever more evident and amplified in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Even though the women are playing a crucial role in the response to the pandemic, be it as nurses, teachers, or community workers, it is also reported that the pandemic is having a disproportionate negative impact on women and girls. In connection with the pandemic, women are already suffering from rising gender-based violence, also rising domestic violence. During the lockdown, the world experienced during the spring. The United Nations also reports of the tendencies that resources are being diverted from women's health, including sexual and reproductive health, and that the pandemic could have a long-term impact on girls' education and women's employment. Likewise, the pandemic doesn't improve the score on women's participation in political decision-making and in peace processes. These tendencies are ever more troubling if we consider that in its core, women, peace and security is essentially a crisis prevention agenda. In the past 20 years, as our Canadian colleague just also mentioned, the academic research and practice have demonstrated the close links between gender equality, conflict prevention, and peace. There is evidence that the condition of women and the condition of nations go hand in hand. Women's economic participation grows economies and inclusive prosperity. Their engagement in peace processes and peace negotiations helps to sustain peace, stability, and security. Societies that uphold women's rights are more peaceful and prosperous. And as responsible members of international community, we ought to ask what can we do to reverse the negative trends on the full enjoyment of all human rights by women and girls, and on the slow pace of the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Perhaps the most straightforward approach is just to uphold the commitments we have already taken. We welcome the steps to increase accountability for the implementation of women, peace and security related actions. From Estonian perspective, this was one of the reasons for our decision to join as a catalytic member of the Generation Equality Global Compact on Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action led by UN Women. Estonia's first national action plan on women, peace and security was adopted in 2010. Now we are in the process of preparing our third generation action plan in cooperation with civil society partners and other relevant domestic stakeholders. As Estonia serves as an elected member of the UN Security Council in 2020 and 2021, it is crystal clear for us that women, peace and security should become an integral part of each of the Council's discussions and outcomes. The Council itself has indeed taken a clear decision in that regard. However, despite our and other like-minded countries' best efforts in the Council, this commitment is sometimes regrettably not upheld in the context of mandate renewals and country-specific resolutions. Estonia continues to work for the Security Council unity on this topic. Nevertheless, we regret that in October the Council was faced with a draft resolution on women, peace and security, which risked to undermine the Security Council agreements to date, including the most recent resolutions on women, peace and security. Moreover, it also risks to undermine the work of women peace builders in countries around the world. On the positive note, there was a clear cross-regional opposition to the potential weakening of the WPS normative framework, and the dissatisfaction therefore didn't concern only the so-called Western countries in the Security Council. Dear friends, the year 2020 is important because of the 20th anniversary of the Resolution 1325, but it might turn out to be even more important as it might represent the historic juncture between losing hard-fought gains on gender equality and peace and recovering better from COVID-19 pandemic. Pushback on the human rights of women and girls weakens also the women, peace and security agenda and cannot be accepted. The shrinking of political, civic and physical space for women's participation, either in political decision-making or peace processes, needs to be opposed. Cooperation of various stakeholders, in particular the civil society organizations and women peace builders, is crucial here. After all, the WPS agenda would not have come into being in the first place, and it would not be possible to make it a reality without them. We need political will and joint action to stand up to threats and reprisals against women human rights defenders, and all this, of course, needs resources, and this is one of the reasons Estonia already for years has provided core funding for the UN Women, the office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence and conflict, and also the United Nations team of experts on rule of law and sexual violence and conflict, while supporting also bilateral projects targeted at girls' education and women empowerment in conflict or post-conflict situations. So thank you once more for having me, and I stop here now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anton. I think that you will definitely have questions either from panel or from participants of the Riga conference. And I would like to encourage everybody who is watching right now the discussion to send in their questions, which will be answered later after all of our speakers will present their views. Thank you very much. And now I would like to invite Jacqueline O'Neill. And Ambassador already mentioned that she is the first ambassador for Women, Peace and Security in Canada, and she was appointed by Prime Minister last year. And she provides advices to ministers of foreign affairs, defense, and numerous other departments. And also she was engaged in implementation of Canada's National Action Plan. And looking at Madam Neill's CV, it's an interesting example, which I wanted to mention here, that she was engaged in supporting more than 30 countries in drafting their national strategies and policy frameworks. So very, very rich and very interesting experience. So thank you very much. And could you please share your view on Canada's achievements and probably what are future prospects and what are challenges? So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor, and thanks for that kind introduction, and greetings to everyone from Ottawa, Canada. As our tremendous ambassador, Canadian ambassador, just noted in his very moving opening, it's a very somber day here in Canada, as well as today is also our National Remembrance Day. So it's a national holiday, and at 11 a.m. in about an hour, the whole country has 2 minutes of silence to remember everyone who served our country and to reflect on the collective horrors of war. And I think our Latvian colleague just explained it extremely well, that this agenda, this Women, Peace and Security agenda, is essentially a conflict prevention agenda. And so I think it's really fitting that we are talking about women, peace and security together today. And I think it's wonderful that you're doing it ahead of the full conference so that this can be in your minds as you're discussing all of the rest of the issues. So Ambassador Rex did just a beautiful job, I think, in framing the many ways that Canada sees the value of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and how it is not just a so-called politically correct thing to do, but is both a very specific reflection of our beliefs that all people have equal human rights to participate, and that when women in particular are included, there are very practical benefits to all of us. So after all this great framing that I've heard from other speakers, I think I can jump right into Canada's experience and share a little bit more about some of our successes, as well as some of the many challenges that we continue to have. And it's been just wonderful to read Latvia's new National Action Plan. Whenever I read these things, I'm always have an antenna up on my radar about things that we can steal in Canada, and I probably shouldn't use the word steal, but more so be inspired by in Canada. And there are many, many things in your plan that we already will be learning from. So, you know, as Ambassador Rex mentioned, we were, as Canada, very proud to support 1325. And you mentioned time on the Security Council and Latvia's ambitions. We wish you the best. The last time that Canada was on the council was 20 years ago. And that was at the passage of 1325. And we were very, very strong supporters of it then, with Namibia, with Bangladesh, with Jamaica, with many other countries. And at the time, and as the professor mentioned, it was very formative for us, in part because we were committed to a concept of human security. And that was a key theme of our time on the council. And so women, peace and security was a very natural fit. You know, linking the distinct concept really help us understand how women, peace and security helps us all achieve a broader notion of security that goes beyond just a state-centered definition, but to all of the aspects that keep people secure. And over the last 20 years, we've also had a lot of developments within Canada that helped us to advance a strong national action plan. So a strong women's movement within Canada, a lot of changes within our own armed forces, our police forces, et cetera. And that led to us having a national action plan. So we are now on our second. Our first one was released in 2011. And the second one was in 2017. We have 5 priority areas. They relate to many of the traditional areas around national action plans. So participation, resolving conflict, preventing conflict, meeting needs of women and girls in humanitarian settings, strengthening the capacity of peace operations. And as I mentioned, we have some insights along the way in a few areas where we're certainly still challenged. So I'll name just 3 areas that we've learned, or sort of insights I think that we've gained along the way. And then one is the importance of civil society's engagement throughout the process. And our colleagues have mentioned this already. You know from the Latvian experience as well, that working with non-governmental organizations is just crucial. They are why we have Resolution 1325 to begin with. They've really moved our government and governments around the world to take action and to make sure that we follow through it and do what we committed to do. And they also, above keeping us accountable, they help keep us connected and linked to movements, to work around the world, and make sure that our policies are as grounded as possible. And so in our first National Action Plan, we did not have an official role for civil society. In our second, we created an official role, so civil society and the government co-chair what we call our advisory council. So every year we have 2 meetings co-chaired by government and civil society to check in on the progress of our National Action Plan. The second insight I think that we've gained is really the value, although it can be difficult at times, of truly working across the government and making it a national action plan in the truest sense. So our first National Action Plan had 3 departments: Defense, Foreign Affairs, and our police. And now we have 9. It even launched with 7, and then we added 2 since the launch of the second National Action Plan. And that makes sense, obviously, because the issue of women's inclusion and exclusion is so complex. We have to tackle it from multiple angles. And one of the many things I want to steal/be inspired by your National Action Plan is your work on education and your specific naming in Latvia of younger generations as a priority, and working with the Ministry of Education and Science in the working group to draft the National Action Plan. It's a hugely important aspect that I think our plan and our folks in Canada can very much learn from. And I think both of our plans now also reflect what is acknowledged to be good practice, which is a National Action Plan that doesn't only look abroad or only look domestically, but blends both of them. And the third insight I think that I'd share is that we have really, I think, evolved our understanding about the importance of our leaders being clear about both the goals and ambition of our plan, but also being confident enough to share the challenges that we face and to be open about them. So we have a National Action Plan that sets really bold ambitions. And as our ambassador just mentioned, we also have a lot of challenges at home. So our Chief of Defense Staff launched what they call Operation Honor. It's a 5-year campaign to address sexual misconduct within Canadian Armed Forces. And he has an expression, he says, if there is an incident of sexual assault that involves Canadian Armed Forces, he is notified at the same speed at which he's notified of a missile strike. What this says is that this is an issue we have to acknowledge exists and deal with. You know, Ambassador Rex also spoke to the barriers that Indigenous women in Canada face. And it's crucial that we continue to talk about that and recognize that we have challenges at home and not be afraid to talk about them, because I think it gives all of us working on it a little more space to do so. So to end, I'll just share 2 brief challenges that I think we continue to deal with, and I think we can all continue to work together on. One of those relates to challenges of monitoring and evaluating national action plans. And, you know, we end up with a lot of reports. I think sometimes it's very hard to figure out what we're learning from our reports and how do we tell the story of this work. We all have examples, we have kind of vignettes, we call them sometimes, of difference that things have made, but it's still hard to describe, I think, on a policy level and on a reporting level, going beyond counting numbers, which is extremely important. The numbers are a prerequisite for a lot of change. But how do we also measure policy changes? How do we measure behavior changes? How do we measure impacts on communities around the world and draw a link between this work and some of the positive outcomes? And, you know, sometimes we want to do things like counting meetings and describing, well, this is the first time, for example, that this military community came together with this activist community, and that's a big deal. And yet, for many good reasons, kind of reporting that meetings took place is not necessarily the most impactful thing. So it can be a challenge to have a long-term perspective on this, but we're all getting there much better. And the last thing I'll say that we, again, hope to work with you very much on and learn from you about, as well as share our own experiences, is just the challenge of fully integrating thinking about this into all training and education, all of our education for diplomats, at military academies, at professional military education, even within universities. It's not easy, but it's easier to do standalone courses or a separate module at the end of a session to talk about, as our ambassador was saying, the difference between sex and gender. What is our national action plan? What are the reasons why this is a valuable concept? It's harder to integrate this into courses on planning, courses on strategy, to really get a handle on it in conflict analysis and really work it into every simulation, every military exercise. But it's important to do. And I think, like many people, I have a dream that this will also be taught and introduced earlier and earlier in universities and in schools, so that the first time that people hear about this concept of women, peace, and security and the value of gender equality to the full society is not when they're already in their positions of power and influence, but as they're being trained and formed. So I'll leave it there. We're very happy to take questions. And again, a huge congratulations to Latvia on the launch of your new National Action Plan. And thanks to all of our allies and partners on this call for all of us standing together in support of this really important work. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Indeed, you mentioned several very important points. Sometimes if we look at the title of one or another policy document and it belongs to UN, then we consider that it's automatically only international endeavor. However, it's not only about international activities, it's very much about homework, about how we domestically treat this issue and whether we are able really to integrate into our thinking and later on translate it into policy. So thank you very much for bringing this point. And now I would like to give floor to our next speaker, to Claire Hutchinson, and she serves as NATO Secretary General Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security, and she does it since 2018. And like our previous speaker, Ms. Hutchinson also was very much engaged in practical work, working with such countries as Kosovo and Lebanon, and of course working also for the United Nations. So, Madam Hutchinson, you are now with NATO. NATO 2 years ago revived the whole exercise. So are you happy with what happened and what has to be achieved? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I'm so delighted to be with you. And of course, on this day when we remember our colleagues who have fallen and all those who serve in the interest of peace. It's been 20 years since the adoption of Resolution 1325, and for NATO, we have seen a huge amount of progress. And I'm delighted that in the last few years, I could be part of this journey as we sort of move the needle, as we would say, from taking it step by step to really robustly advancing this agenda. And we do recognize that Resolution 1325 wasn't made with NATO in mind. The idea that the resolution was for peace activism and the collection of really wonderful, and I know many of them, women who drove this agenda forward. And at the time in 2000, we as NATO didn't necessarily put wholesome interest into this. But we have long invested in looking at women in NATO forces and women in the military, starting from 1961, when we first addressed this in a conference in Copenhagen. And then we established our first committee for women in NATO forces in 1976. So we've got a long history of looking at women specifically in our forces. But when it comes to the transformative role of women, peace and security, and that is what is of interest, how this is transforming defense forces and the forces and the work that we do here in NATO, it came after 1325. But today we are very much, as you'd say in the UN, seized of this matter, and that it has become a priority for the Secretary General, for the chair of the military committee, for the work that we do, and all of our allies and partners. So we first started working in earnest really in 2007 with the adoption of our first policy on women, peace and security. And we revised this in 2018. And this is where we introduced our 3 principles, our principles of integration, inclusiveness, and integrity. So integration for NATO means that we are incorporating gender perspectives into everything we do, from policies, programs, from our military doctrine, both at home, in headquarters, but also in the theatre. But it's also important that we integrate it not just in operational work, but in how we develop defense capabilities. We enhance the work we do on resilience and also on our intelligence requirements. Because the security challenges of today are not the same as they were 20 years ago. More complex, more hidden. In some cases, we have to look at the evolving and revolving threats and risks that we have. And that includes how do we put gender into international terrorism, into cyber, into the work we would do in organized crime, and all of the other connected threats and risks we have. So to help with that, we've also developed an institutional structure, starting with, in 2012, the establishment of this special representative post, the one I sit on currently, which I think was a huge shift for NATO and has really helped move the work because it's coming from the very top, from the advisor to the Secretary General all the way down. And of course, we have gender advisors who are also in place to give that strategic advice. Because we really believe that the integration of women, peace and security from the perspective of policy is the key. It is the key. But of course, inclusiveness, our second I, is also important. And that's how do we increase numbers of women. Now, today in NATO, across all of our allies, we have 12% of women. And that's not a huge amount, but it ranges from 20% in some nations. In Latvia and Canada, for example, we're looking 15, 16%, all the way down to 3%. So it's a huge range of women in the different forces. And we also, more importantly, have almost about 20 nations who have all of their positions open for women. And that is something that is very key, because it's not just about having women engaged or deployed, but it's also about making sure they can work in every position, from infantry to special forces. And that should be key for all of our allies. And we're pushing to move that from 85% to 100% of positions open. Because we really believe that, and this is very important, that there has to be a connection between parity and participation, so balance, but integration. Because you cannot just have numbers of women and expect something to change if the culture doesn't change and the policy dynamic doesn't change. So we have this 2-pronged approach. And then our final I is on integrity. And that's very important because that is about the conduct of behavior. And as anyone who knows who's been deployed, the trust that community has in you in deployment, the work that you do on the ground, it has to be seen. And we have, I'm really pleased that last year we adopted our very first policy on preventing and responding to sexual exploitation abuse. And now we're implementing our action plan. And that was an enormous deal for us because it really puts into play our principles of how we believe behavior. And as Jackie's just talked about, in terms of getting that messaging back and demonstrate it, that the commitment made to behavior is so important for the trust of troops. We know that sustainable peace cannot be achieved without gender equality. And we know that the treatment of women in any country is a barometer for other forms of oppression. And so we've learned this over the years. And we also know that women act as catalysts for peace. But we also have learned that women aren't always in the commitment to peace. They also have many roles they play. And some of this is also in support of terrorism. They can be perpetrators of violence and terrorism. They're supporters, enablers, they're also mobilizers. So women like men have multifaceted roles, and we have to take this into account as we move forward. So we've learned a lot, we've come far, but where do we go from here? So there's 3 particular areas we're going to be focusing on over the next year. One is on resonance of connecting all the dots, making sure that our agenda on women, peace and security is across everything we do. So making sure that we're not just talking to women, peace and security, the like-minded and the supportive, but also those who may not see a natural fit. We need to be making sure that women, peace and security is not on the margins of security, but at the center of the conversation on security. And right now, in many places, we see that there's still conversations taking place where it's only about women, peace and security. And we need it to be in all of the conversations on security. And so that is going to be important. And to make sure for NATO that it's in our key documents, our decisions and our declarations, that everything is infused with gender. The second area we're going to focus on is responsibility. That will and conviction must be spoken, actions must follow. And that has to come from leadership, and that we have to make sure that on all our national forces, that leadership is speaking, as it is in many countries that we see. Our Secretary General is very committed, and this is a priority, and that has to be spoken by every leader. And that we have to see things like leaders in training, making sure the training is taking place. I have been deployed when I've seen commanders sitting all the way through training. And because of that, people get trained. When you don't have leadership commitment, things don't often happen the same way. And we know this. And so we're demonstrating our commitment, knowing that this is a political and operational tool. We're making sure that everybody is taking responsibility. And that is really important. And we have recently, I'm very pleased, we recently in October, as part of our anniversary work, launched our first leadership task force, which is chaired by a Deputy Secretary General. And that is across all of our leadership at headquarters, as well as our military and political. So that's a great achievement for us. The third is on relationships. We have to work together. We have to work better together across international organizations. We have to work with civil society, and we have a civil society advisory panel, because speaking to women where they are most affected and can help us understand and frame our conceptualization of women, peace and security is very important. And NATO is no different to any other organization. We have to make sure the voices of women are put into the work that we do. So we also have to work with the EU and the UN, as we already are, but we have to make sure we're not speaking from different voices. The end goal is gender equality. We all are on the same road. We come at it from different places, but we have to make sure we're in solidarity as we move forward. And then lastly, results, and Jackie just referenced this as well, about measuring success. It is not always easy to measure mindset and to change. And that is really what we're aiming for. We are seeing this at NATO as a transformation of the way we do our business. And of course, national action plans, and congratulations, you are, Latvia is the most recent ally of ours to be on board, and we're delighted with that. And we have to encourage everybody to get on board with national action plans. But also, how do you measure them? And we are now introducing progress markers and tracking on our own action plan. And it's taking us a long time to do, because it's a very difficult thing to do. And it's sort of laborsome and not a popular job. But how do we measure? And we're looking at doing better measurement, making sure that we get sex disaggregated data. We're doing a manual right now on sex disaggregated data and really pushing this. And I think COVID really opened to us the necessity of understanding sex disaggregated data and how it builds into analysis. So we're going to be doing that more over this year. And we also are currently doing an evaluation of ourselves over 20 years. Where have we come from, and what more do we need to do? Because we are really serious about this. This is a serious endeavor. It's taken on board by everyone, but we have to do better, quicker. And that is very clear to us. So we are moving beyond words. We know that we can't measure ourselves just by action plans, and that we can't measure ourselves by really nice words. But we do have to make sure that our commitment is there, and that is there. Tick, we have that. But we really do have to make sure we're institutionalizing the work that we have. And as we move forward, for us, we know that empowerment and effective protection is not just a benefit for women, it's a benefit for everybody. And as an alliance of over 1 billion people collectively, we can set a tone, and that's what we plan to do. NATO plans to be a leader in women, peace and security, and to be able to set the way forward so that we bring all our allies together, we influence our partners, and we forge a path past the 20th anniversary, because we really intend to do our part to change the way we do our business and to make sure that the work we do is about lasting security for everybody. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your very wide overview of everything what NATO is doing and what NATO stands today. And indeed, your plea for actions is something I think what civil society and also countries are looking for. So thank you very much. And now I will pass floor to our Latvian speaker, Kaspars Ozoliņš, who works with security issues and international organization issues. And Kaspars Ozoliņš is one of senior ambassadors in Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and over years he was working with security issues wherever you were sent. Kaspars, as far as I remember, you always in one or another way were dealing with security issues. Even while working in Denmark as an ambassador, you also kept an eye on security issues. So what would be Latvia's stance on women, peace and security right now when Latvia is preparing for competition for Security Council? Please, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Ambassador Kevin Rex of Canada for cooperation and support for this event, which was planned as one of the events of our newly adopted National Action Plan. So this year it is more through the internet, but I'm glad that all of you were able to take part in this discussion. I also want to thank all the previous speakers for willingness to contribute to this side event of the Riga conference. And here, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is not only organizing this side event on women, peace, security, but is also co-organizer of Riga conference for 15 years, which has been a flagship conference in the region devoted for security and defense. And it is only fitting that the issue of gender equality and empowerment of women in context of peace and security is brought to attention of listeners of discussion within the framework of this conference. Let us assume and let us imagine that with this discussion on UN Resolution 1325, we are also warming up discussion of 4 presidents that is going to take tomorrow, the 3 presidents of the Baltic states and the president of Finland. And their topic will be on United Nations at 75, which is also going to take place during this conference. So it's not very customary that United Nations issues are brought up on the agenda of Riga conference, but and I think this is, as I said, this is only fitting that we are giving more thought to the role of the women and the gender equality, empowerment of women in the context of conflict, security, and peace building. Gender equality, women's rights, and empowerment of women are important parts of Latvian overall approach to human rights. It has been a long-standing priority of the Latvia in international organizations. This policy of Latvia on human rights and gender equality stems not only from the international legal instruments and norms, but actually is enshrined in short 100 roughly paras of our national constitution. Sort of indication that is not just a declaratory policy is the fact that Latvia, according to the World Bank Women, Business and the Law Index of 2019, is one of only 6 countries in the world that has complete legal gender equality. I mention this only as a fact that underscores that since inception, Latvian state takes seriously human rights issues in general and gender equality in particular. With adoption of current National Action Plan, we are focusing on streamlining integrated approach in national response the women, peace, security agenda. The coordination of government ministries is led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with involvement of NGOs, civil society, and also international partners. And as I heard from the previous presentations, the initial national plans were rather limited in their scope and the partnerships. So in that sense, I think I didn't count how many partners did we have, but our current plan has at least 10 partners with whom we cooperated right at the very beginning and at the very outset. So in that sense, I'm very glad and I'm very delighted to see that even Canada, who is a champion on the gender equality issues, that was able to learn also something from our perspective. And as it was said at the very beginning, Canada is one of our closest international partners in this respect, and we are going to continue cooperating on this issue also in the future. Our national action plan is focused on near-term outcomes and also on the long-term impacts. And the long-term impacts that were mentioned also already by the Jacqueline O'Neill is something that I think is one of the most important parts of our current national action plan. So it basically it's relatively simple. So it's three main focus areas of the current plan: is raising awareness on women, peace, and security agenda within civil service, which is also important, as it was mentioned by the Ambassador Rex as well, among the general public and especially among the youth. And the second is awareness raising on women, peace and security matters in the armed forces and police structures of our country. And the third focus area is international cooperation, both in a way like we do it with Canada, but also actually trying to be a partner to other countries. And as Ms. Hutchinson mentioned, so we work with the partners, and this is also something that we are introducing in our cooperation with our partners through the NATO contact point embassy, let's say, system. And this is one of the topics that we will be bringing up on the agenda as we perform the duties of a contact point embassy. So the women, peace, security will be also within the NATO context by us brought in discussions with the partners of NATO. So as I said already, of the three areas, one of the most important and impactful long-term measures is introducing issue of gender equality and gender-based violence is a rolling skill in the curriculum in all education levels at school, starting from the primary level. So this is already sort of, it is implemented, and we are sort of starting sort of implementation of that goal. Regarding the participation in international missions of our military crisis managers and managers and peacekeepers, Latvia is expanding our traditional international participation in the missions beyond the United Nations, and we're also going to OSCE and UN missions. So this was our path, and the other thing is that our participation in international missions basically started with participation in military missions, and now only over the time we are moving on to more civilian and border guards and police types of missions. What does it mean? That means that increasingly, we see that the role of women in the Latvian international missions and operations or advisory missions will only be growing. They are already well represented in the missions, reaching participation levels of 12%, for instance, for border guard missions under the EU Frontex agency, and 20% for civilian experts in EU and OSCE missions. We, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, are trying to actively promote greater involvement of women in participation in these levels, in these missions on the levels that would better reflect gender balance in our armed forces, and police, border guards, as well as of the pool of civilian experts. As it was mentioned already by Madame Hutchinson, and thank you for that, 16% of our armed forces are composed of women. And interestingly is that our National Guard, which is a voluntary military organization, has even greater participation of women than the National Armed Forces. So as we go in international missions, as we participate in the work of international organizations, we are trying to increase the level of women participation at the levels which is commensurate with what we see here in our countries. What does it mean from the perspective of national action plan? It is foreseen to increase awareness training in armed forces and police structures. We also are planning to establish positions of gender advisors and gender consultants in the armed forces and police structures as well. The other interesting, I'm not expert on national action plans of other countries, but I think one of the interesting feature of our plan is that it foresees a communication and outreach, whereas more than a dozen publicly recognizable personalities have agreed to act as a so-called messengers of women, peace and security agenda within our national action plan. And these messengers are representatives from the parliament, from the government, from the youth organizations, NGOs, and even business representatives. So you see that we have already sort of, with this, let's say, integrated approach, we have addressed and we have talked to all stakeholders, let's say many stakeholders within our society, and trying to make the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, Security as comprehensive and encompassing as possible. Women's empowerment has also been horizontal priority in our development cooperation. We have set targets for assistance that has to be spent on gender equality projects, and we are in the process of doubling that target in the next planning period. Furthermore, we intend to expand geography of development assistance beyond predominantly Eastern European and Central Asian regions to other regions in the world as well, where our sort of assistance would be more impactful, also including on WPS agenda. Development assistance and other forms of international cooperation will allow us to have wider impact concerning implementation also of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and especially on gender equality. In our national SDG implementation plan, gender equality is one of the priority areas also for the goal number 17, which is partnerships for goals. So that is also one way how we try to sort of introduce the women, peace and security agenda as well. So I will conclude here, and in conclusion, let me stress that we must, of course, continue to step up efforts to advance empowerment of women and their inclusive engagement in conflict areas and beyond. This is important part on the road to secure, peaceful and sustainable future. And Latvia is and will remain committed to this goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaspar, very much for your overview of what has Latvia achieved in recent years, and indeed, National Action Plan is very comprehensive, and I looked it through very carefully, and I was really pleased to see that those both dimensions, domestic and international, are quite equally presented there, and the issue which you mentioned, raising awareness of those issues, is of particular importance indeed. Thank you very much. And now I'm looking at questions which were streamed into our discussion by our team, and I would like to start with a question which is asked to Arvo Anton, because it was Jacqueline O'Neill who mentioned the role of measurement, how to measure performance and achievements in VPS sector. And the question goes as follows. Given that Estonia already has 2 national action plans for VPS, what have been the main conclusions, successes or failures? Please, Arvo, are you here?
Yes, I'm still with you. Hi. The question is very wide and not easy to answer. One of the perhaps more broad answer could be that it's an ongoing work. So when we talk about awareness raising or empowerment of women in conflict areas or post-conflict situations, it needs constant effort. And also domestically in Estonia, when we talk about training or awareness raising in our armed forces or in civil service, this topic of women, peace and security is not so recognized perhaps yet, and when people change positions, new officials are being recruited, so this starts again. And internationally, of course, in our current position in as elected member of the Security Council, this has been the perhaps main focus of our efforts on women, peace and security agenda, especially this year, to perhaps protect and try to advance the existing normative framework on women, peace and security on UN and in the Security Council level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You are very right. Very often policy priorities and intensity of implementation of policy priorities depend on personalities who already developed certain capabilities in one or another sector. And particularly when we talk about VPS, there are not so many experts in our countries for obvious reasons, but therefore probably such ambassadors, people representatives, or whatever you call civil society leaders, would fill this gap. And in case if one or another expert on government level leaves for another position, those civil ambassadors could step in and to keep up this issue on the agenda. So thank you very much. But so it looks that Estonia doesn't do this measurement exercise yet. Yeah. Okay, so there is another question which goes for Claire. Are you here? And the question is, within the NATO budget, how much waste does VPS agenda have?
Never enough. So we obviously have a small budget that we have for our work, but of course we get a lot of support from both our allies and partners. But I don't think you can ever have enough resources, never have enough money, never have enough time, and never have enough focus. So we want more of everything.
Okay, thank you. Let's hope that our wish will be heard. Here is another question which probably could be asked to all of you because it requires some kind of policy implication response. And the question is as follows. How can formal frameworks between countries can help ensure that VPS priorities do not backslide? So how to ensure that relations between countries serve in favor of keeping VPS high on the agenda. So probably we could start with Kasper, with you, and then go reverse order.
Okay, so I'll try to give a very short and brief response. So I will start with what I was saying at the very beginning, so that the human rights issues and gender equality is part of our national policies, and it's actually part of the Constitution. So basically, I cannot imagine circumstances under which the women, peace and security agenda, empowerment of women, participation of women could backslide. So the question is actually if we have enough progress all of the time or most of the time to keep issue, let's say, relevant enough for resolving the conflicts with empowering and having participation of the women, of the actors on the ground in the conflict areas, because for the most part it's not us nationally. I mean, it's not necessarily NATO. It's not other organizations, institutions. So it might be UN agencies, and it might be civil sector, and it can be NGOs. I think this is a no-brainer. This will remain on the agenda, and it is important to support actually the ones and work together. I think I support the point that was raised by Clara Hutchinson, that we have to cooperate and improve cooperation with all of the international partners, be it organizations, be it NGOs or actors on the ground. This way we will find the best ways probably how to engage, how to improve results on the ground. And this is actually how we came about our plan, because we did not want to create something on our own for ourselves. So we wanted to go broad and wide and invite everybody and discuss with everybody. And of course, the more people you have, the more ideas you have, the best plan you possibly will have at the end. So I'll stop here probably. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Claire, what would be your take on this issue?
Thank you. Yeah, I think one thing I've learned over the many years of working on women's rights is that gains made can be lost. And I think it's very important that we always keep our foot on the pedal and move forward. And I think NATO is one, as an alliance is well placed to do that, because as I said, by leading by example, we have frameworks like the European Atlantic Community, the APC. We have the Partnership for Peace program. We have many formats where we can work together and make sure that women, peace and security is always on the front burner. And I think just to recall as well, the idea of working together, it's very easy to do divide and conquer. And I believe that we must come together as international community. We must come together to make sure that we solidify the gains we have made over the last 20 years. And that means that international organizations, and including civil society, and I say this to civil society colleagues who may not necessarily understand or appreciate NATO's role, work with us to find the common platform where we can advance. Don't work against us, because we are all on the same road to equality. We are committed to this. We just have different ways of getting there. And so I think we working together and making sure that within the framework, we are leading, we're showing by example, and that our allies are putting our best foot forward as well with our partners, but we work together to make sure this works.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Neil, what would be your take on this issue?
That's not surprising. I agree with both my colleagues, and I'll pick up on the point about how easy it can be to divide and conquer. And our colleague, Mr. Anton, noted this as well about what happened recently at the Security Council at the UN. And there's a big movement around this area that is incorrect. And it's a movement that says that this concept emerged from the so-called West or the global North countries, et cetera. And that just couldn't be more true. We mentioned in the Security Council, it was Namibia, Bangladesh, and others who brought it on the council. It was brought from women and militaries as well around the world who identified the value of focusing on inclusion. And so there's a narrative that many people are trying to push that says that this is something that is foreign and cannot be, imposed upon our country. So when we have partnerships and alliances, and when we state these things clearly together, it's a message of saying, no, this is a value that is broadly shared, not by a handful of countries, but it's broadly shared. And we have to, there's real value in ensuring that the counter messaging to that doesn't get traction. And so as we think about our partnerships, we do have to state that this is a priority. If we don't name it, it's just not going to rise to the top. And I believe a lot in the power of holding each other accountable and the social pressure. We're still human beings at our core, and we behave rationally, and we want to be part of a group doing important things, and we want to make progress within a community. So I think holding each other to account is really important. And then once we know the priority and we're working on it together, we can really think through operationally together. And I think that's so important. So, in military to military partnerships, there's a space for thinking about this, even in terms of who is going on which exchanges to which countries. If Canadians continuously go to Latvia, if they're continuously chosen to be men, that's a career progression. They get more advantages. They're seen in higher esteem by their colleagues, and then that leads to a train of progression through the organization. We have to think about every single engagement that we have and how it advances inclusion and provides equal opportunities for both men and women to advance. And the last thing I'd say on that is, we have it, as Claire mentioned, COVID has opened up a wide range of opportunities for collaboration, not least because many of us now have very shared priorities. So we have, first of all, an understanding of the fact that security can and should be very broadly defined, which is the essence of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Guns and tanks and weapons were not the first thing that we reached to fight this pandemic. And so we needed a much broader sense of security. And then we've also, I think through this, had developed much better understandings of the ways that that gender, that class, that ethnicity, that rural versus urban, that all kinds of way of disaggregating our communities impacts our policies. And so if we can work together through agreements and also bilaterally with various countries to think about what we've learned through this pandemic and how we respond in a way that is as responsible and effective as possible, I think that will really help advance women, peace, and security as a concept.
Thank you very much. What about Arvo Anton? What is your position on this?
Well, I can only support and echo the colleagues who just spoke, but just to add that, or what was not yet mentioned, is that evidence-based decision-making perhaps is quite important, that if you have a clear research and data showing and demonstrating how important the WPS agenda is and what is the potential positive impact it can have also on so-called hard security, then it's definitely helpful. And the second point that was mentioned also is indeed the role of civil society. So I think that in democratic countries, when we talk about political decision-making or politicians, then some public pressure and pressure from civil society is always helpful to advance some issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Here is one more question which I wanted also to raise for the discussion, and it's addressed to all participants of the panel. Is the cross-sector nature of an effective VPS agenda changing the nature of NATO from a traditional defense alliance? So what do you think? Is it really impact traditional defense alliance nature? Who would like to start from you? Probably Kasper, you were looking at this question and thinking already for a while.
Honestly, I was not, but
Yeah,
we'll
okay.
try. I mean, NATO is a very dedicated organization. NATO countries knows what they do, and if there is a ways we can strengthen our core tasks within the NATO, they will be used. They'll be used for that purpose. And of course, apparently, as we see that the women, peace, and security agenda was brought on the sort of agenda of NATO as well for the simple purpose, because NATO has been involved in international missions in crisis management, and NATO has seen firsthand what does it mean. As Ambassador of Canada was saying, he was a development advisor in Afghanistan. You know, how you can convincingly achieve peace, prosperity, involvement of everybody, empowerment of all parts of the society without actually having them on the table and discussing their futures, or actually the decisions that are devised. Are they sustainable in the long term so that everybody is happy? So I guess the WPS agenda is actually strengthening the NATO core tasks, and one of the tasks of course crisis management, and the third task is cooperation with the partners. So actually, I would rather say that the women, peace, and security agenda is something that is broadening cooperation path with NATO partners, current partners or prospective partners. And I mentioned already one example that we are going to do in the future as well. So I don't see, let's say, a really contradiction in this one. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Arva, what about you? Do you think that it could change the nature of NATO?
Not necessarily. Madam Hutchinson mentioned before that security challenges are changing and becoming more complex. So indeed, I think that women, peace and security is not changing NATO, but realities around us are changing, and NATO perhaps needs to keep pace with this, to stay on top of things. And women, peace and security is perhaps only one aspect of this complexity. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to ask the same question to Ambassador O'Neill, please.
So I'd also pick up on what Claire had mentioned about the world is changing NATO and NATO's responding. And something that we note a lot is that the concept of thinking about women, peace, and security is still too often, I think, thought of as an extra thing to do or a nice to have thing to do once the core elements are dealt with. And, you know, I often talk about how there are many groups of people who view it as very key to their core strategy, and those groups are our adversaries. So our enemies in some cases. You know, when you think about ISIS and Daesh, 1 out of 5 fighters who left Europe and left North America to go fight for ISIS was a woman. So 20% of people who left Europe and North America to fight for ISIS was a woman. And they were often targeted not in a sophisticated strategy, but by having women recruit other women or using messages very much customized to women. They were, as Claire said, there are women who were fighting on the front lines of terrorism. There are women who are trying to prevent it, et cetera. But concepts related to gender, even though not called gender advisors or using the same sometimes complex terminology that we use, they're in the minds of our adversaries. You know, in Africa, Boko Haram, 2/3 of its suicide bombers are women. And the reason they do that is because women can go unnoticed in markets. They can draw less attention. All kinds of reasons why it's important operationally and provides what many perceive to be a tactical advantage in all forms of warfare, including cyber. You know, we deal with all sorts of gendered dimensions of cyber, and we can unpack those separately. But every single issue, I think, has a gender dimension if you unpack it thoughtfully enough. And I think that what NATO is doing is exactly as my previous speakers just said, is they're responding and trying to get ahead of these dimensions, not viewing it as a separate or add-on type of issue.
Thank you. And to Madam Hutchinson, so you are from NATO, how you would address this issue?
Thank you. Well, I agree with everyone. I mean, ultimately, NATO is a defense, political and military alliance, the biggest one in the world. That is our core task. That's our job. But as everyone's saying, the changing nature of conflict, the changing complex security challenges have changed us all. And I think what is interesting is that it's often changed the way nations' militaries are seeing themselves. And we've seen, again, going back to COVID, the changes to, in terms of crisis management, the work of the militaries. I think what Women, Peace and Security has done, it has broadened that understanding of a human security approach to how we would fit a population-centric approach, of which 50% of a population is women plus, and how do we understand security from a woman's perspective? We are doing a project right now in NATO. We've been doing it for the last year, and we're encouraging all of our allies to work with us on this and our partners. And it's a project on women's perception of defense and security. And we're asking women, what does defense mean to you? What does protection mean to you? It means very different to women as it does to men. And we're building that into our analysis as we look at how do we tackle complex security challenges. As Jackie said about terrorism, the work we do in countering terrorism, we're putting it into looking at women who are exponentially growing in terms of hackers in systems or getting into computer and looking at cyber hygiene from a woman's perspective. We're looking at the complex challenges from security, and Women, Peace and Security has given us that platform to allow us to broaden, reach, grow in the way we understand security and defense, and build that into all the work we're doing. So I think we in Women, Peace and Security have changed as well. We've changed to adapt to new security threats. The series of resolutions have only allowed us to step further into that. For example, Resolution 2242, which talks, about women and the role of terrorism, and then small arms and light weapons. We have a plethora of issues now to deal with. I think we as an alliance have just found ourselves stronger than ever, because we really have embraced this mandate. We've embraced human security as well as women, peace and security. And I think we found, as Secretary General said in his 2030, in his process on 2030, women, peace and security and human security are central to this. So we certainly recognize we have become different in a way, but different in a better way. And so we're strengthening everything we do, and NATO has become stronger because of it.
Thank you very much. I look at questions which came in, and our time is running out. But there are really few questions which I wanted to ask you. Probably I will target directly. So I would like to start with a question which is asked to Kasper Sozolinch. What is the state of Baltic VPS cooperation, and how can it be expanded?
So I think we, on our side, nationally, if we look at the Women, Peace, Security agenda from the perspective of national action plans, indeed, we have the first one. So, and there is a great potential for working on that in the future as well. But what concerns cooperation in international organizations in United Nations, we are working already together, all of our countries, and we have been working together. What Arvo Anton was mentioning, the resolution, recent resolution at the United Nations Security Council was watered down language on women, peace, security standards. So this is an example of cooperation of the Baltic states and together with the European Union countries and other like-minded countries. So there is it is not new field, it is not a new issue, but of course you have a different kind and types of political, diplomatic, practical, whatever ways of cooperation.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have only 2 minutes left, and I would like really to thank all participants for their views, and our exchange of views was so lively that actually I would love to continue this discussion. But we have at least to finalize our discussion with some takeaways which at least seemed to me what we agreed upon during those 1 hour and a half. I think that we all agree that it's very important to do job domestically, to strengthen civil society, to incorporate VPS in education and training, to raise awareness of what VPS is about. Then we all agreed on international perspective of VPS, where each institution does its own job, like UN has its own agenda, where VPS is part of its different actions. The same could be said about NATO, also about the EU, and also the Baltic states, as Kaspars mentioned, also coordinate those efforts. But sometimes it seems that these are internal organizational agendas, and it's very important that they meet each other, that they integrate VPS best practices from different organizations and also countries' perspectives. Another point which also all of you mentioned, that it's time to move from plans, from documents to actions. And this was also reflected in questions which were asked. How to move to actions, how to really foster decisions which are made by governments, by international organizations, but also how to encourage individuals to participate in VPS issues. Another point mentioned today was the role of partnerships. And not only partnerships which are built on interactions between international organizations, but these are also partnerships among different civil organizations, partnerships built with local communities and those who are engaged in peace-making process. And the last point which I wanted to mention here is that probably we all have to think about measurements. How to measure? It is a tricky thing. You cannot measure everything. But I think measurement is very much needed in order to prove that success is here. And really, I would like to see that next year, when we come again back to Riga Conference 2021, hopefully live, seeing each other face to face, and we could really talk about deliverables, what has been achieved. So thank you very much for participating. Thank you everybody who was listening online, and I hope we had a very good food for thought, not only for tonight, but at least for 1 year to come. So thank you very much.